Members, it's time to resume the meeting. Next, we have the second round of questioning. Oh, actually, the third round now. Well, actually, Mr. Ng Leung Sing, second round. And then if there are no other questions, then Alan Leung will have a last go. Mr. Ng Leung Sing, thank you, Chairman. I'd like to follow up. By the way, the three of us cannot leave the room. We are here to maintain the quorum. We have no one else. So I cannot go to the IDP panel. Well, never mind. We're going to finish quick. Okay, please. 3.6. Para 3.6. I have questions for the witnesses. In February 2009, the Lands Administration Steering Committee, as pointed out by the chairman, he was asking about the role and status of this committee. I believe it was set up under the HA Bureau. Now, the steering committee considered that on the grounds that the problems caused by roadside skips might not be serious to the extent warranting a legislative exercise to establish a permit system for regulating roadside skips. The administration should first work within the existing statutory powers to tighten enforcement against roadside skips. My question is, this steering committee is supposed to handle the skips, but did it have the power to issue orders? And would you follow their instructions to the letter? If the public should complain so much more against the skips, especially after 2009, as you know, in 2012, the complaints doubled. So I'd like to know whether the steering committee had done enough research and investigation into the issue. And did you give concrete advice to the steering committee? And who were on the steering committee? Who would take the question? The three of you. Is it that you have replaced the steering committee? Chairman, let me say something. The joint working group to be set up by the three bureaus would respond to the proposals in the audit report. I believe we might not be equal to the steering committee of 2009. We would look at our own policy areas and our law enforcement powers and see what we could do. So can you answer the question of the member? Is the steering committee still in existence? If yes, what is its jurisdiction? What is its legal status? Either it exists or it doesn't. Or is it that you're going to set up the joint working group under the steering committee? Well, if you cannot answer the question, it doesn't matter. Chairman, I cannot say for sure whether the steering committee is still in existence because it is not within our bureau. But reading previous papers, it seems the steering committee is not only concerned about skips. It also availed itself to other aspects of street management. Director of Lands, I'd like to provide some information. The steering committee still exists. It is the steering committee on district administration. It coordinates the work of relevant departments on district administration. The chairman is the PS for Home Affairs, and the membership comprises the police, FVHD, the lands department, the HAD, the LCSD, and the TD, etc. But talking about skips, here it is said that the problem might not be serious to the extent warranting the establishment of a permit system. Is it a kind of decision, or is that a guideline for you? Are you obliged to follow it? Did you react to it? Mr. Ng, maybe we can write to the steering committee so it can answer the question. I don't think the departments here can answer the question. I think that is an important point. If you want to follow up on the regulation of skips, we'd like to see whether the steering committee's view led you to be more lax in your work. Mr. Wong, Mr. Yao, you go back to the joint working group that is going to be set up. Perhaps you can also look at this issue about the steering committee. Yes, we'll follow up. Well, I think it would be best for you to try to understand on what basis and data that the steering committee said what it said. Was it based on the number of complaints? Because I understand there were quite a number of complaints. How did it come to this judgment? Did it do any professional research in order to arrive at the conclusion that the skips were not a serious problem? And also, why it considered a permit system not necessary? Did it advance any concrete justifications? Okay, so please, is it that you want us to write to the steering committee, or can you reply to those questions? If you can answer those questions, there is no need for us to write to the steering committee. Can you answer those questions asked by Mr. Ng Liang Sing? Let us look at Gen 1. I read the reply and the papers. Actually, the steering committee comprised the Commissioner of Police, the Commissioner for Transport, and also the Director of Lands. And the HAB, the PS of the HAB was the chairman. In 2010, it made a decision after listening to the Director of Lands, the Commissioner for Police, and also the Commissioner for Transport. So there was no follow-up. It doesn't help for you to call them to come here. They will not be able to answer your questions. Right, the 3 policy secretaries should now answer the question. Right, I think that's the way to go. They have already written in, but they have not answered our questions. So I believe the 3 policy secretaries should answer those questions. The 3 bureaus. Chairman, our view is like this. We feel that at present, as the audit pointed out in his report, the present regulation is inadequate. And in fact, there is quite some room for improvement. That is why there will be a joint working group involving the 3 bureaus. And we want to work on this. And I can give you an example. Chairman, you always mentioned that we should look at it from a transport angle. We admit that we can look at it from this angle. But if we want to do further regulation, then it should not just be from the transport angle. The trade, the recycling industries, etc. There may be a licensing system. The issue would be wider. Would they be happy to be regulated? And this may add to the cost, etc. We have to consider all these factors. And this is not just from the transport angle. I'd just like to point that out. But we would be very happy to follow up what members mentioned. We believe that we need to work on this because what is being done is inadequate. Mr. Ng Liang Sing. 3.18. The police's reaction to serious construction or imminent danger posed by skips. And in these circumstances, the police may remove the skips and also prosecute the operators. May I ask the police this question? What is their understanding about serious obstruction or imminent danger? Because usually, according to the audit report, sometimes the skips are placed in dangerous positions. But in 4.13, the Lands Department has almost said that even if there would be a licensing system, they would still cause obstruction. So does it mean that all the locations where skips are found are bound to cause traffic congestion or obstruction and also danger? But then you are saying that if the situation is not serious, there is no need for the police to take action. I think it is contradictory here. Who has the final say as to whether police action is required? Mr. Low. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ng, for the question. As we said just now, our staff would go to the scene of the complaint. They will have to exercise their professional judgment based on their own experience and professional knowledge. Certainly, there is no definition of serious obstruction or imminent danger. They should base the judgment on their personal experience and personal knowledge, and at the same time we have given them guidelines. For example, the traffic flow at the time, the traffic volume, and also the pedestrian flow and volume, the location of the skip, and also whether it is a no stopping or restriction zone. And if it is in the dark hours, the illumination in the street concerned. We have consulted the DOJ on such guidelines, and the DOJ felt that these were appropriate objective standards in order to judge whether there was serious obstruction or imminent danger. Now, since the judgment itself is important, we would ask the station sergeants or people above that rank to go on site in order to make an inspection. Well, I have looked at the photos with regard to the TD guidelines. In other words, you have to paint it bright yellow, and also there should be yellow reflective bands, and also in the dark hours there should be protection against collision, etc. All these are very well and very concrete. However, if you look at the report, the skips were painted different colors: purple, blue, green, yellowish, and bright yellow. They were painted in a whole array of colors. I believe you would be able to know that these skips are problematic because some of them can hardly be seen in the night, and people might well bump into them. And they are all over the place, and yet you say it is not serious. People can lose their lives if they run into these skips. We have seen all these photos in the report. I'd like to know how many of these have been the subject of your action. In that, have you reflected the situation to your senior officers? You said police officers have to use their own judgment based on their experience, but then it may be difficult for them to make a judgment. Do you consult the DOJ on each and every case, or did you just consult the DOJ on the validity of the guidelines? Commissioner for Transport, can you answer the question on your guidelines first? And then Mr. Low. Yes, Chairman. When the guidelines were written, they were general guidelines to cover the majority of situations. So I can say we went for broad parameters. As the Director of Lands said, if it is well illuminated, even if the skip is not in yellow, it still could be seen quite clearly. But then we try to have guidelines that apply to the general situation, and therefore we prefer to err on the safe side. But each case will have to be judged on its own merit, given the particular time of the day, the particular location, as to whether it poses serious obstruction or imminent danger. Mr. Low, Thank you, Chairman. To echo the Commissioner for Transport, the guidelines are not legally binding. So our staff cannot enforce the law even if the skip is not painted yellow. The guidelines are for reference. As the Commissioner for Transport said, when there is sufficient lighting, when the traffic volume is not high, then perhaps at a certain time of the day when the complaint is lodged, then the police officer does not see serious obstruction and there is no imminent danger posed to other road users, so he makes that judgment instead of just applying the guidelines to say the skip is not in yellow or red and white, so there is imminent danger. Mr. Ng Liang Sing.
These specific law enforcement guidelines, you need to standardize them with the frontline staff. Otherwise, it seems like there's quite a bit of scope when you talk about obstruction or imminent danger. But as a matter of fact, these guidelines are clear. They want certain colors, reflective strips, lighting, and so on. But if you refer to the pictures I talked about, they have all kinds of colors. So blue and purple shouldn't be appropriate colors. So I'd like to ask paragraph 4.13. Paragraph B. If a licensing system was to be established and one of the criteria for licensing was that the skips should not cause road obstruction, a major problem currently caused by roadside skips, no permit could be granted, and all skips would be subject to enforcement action. So I'd like to ask the Lands and Development Bureau if a permit system were established and if there were a standardized approach, how could a permit not be granted? And they could place the skips in areas where there would be no obstruction. And if you want to enforce, that's normal. It's only a problem when you don't enforce the law. So in paragraph B, I'd like to hear your views on what attitude are you taking towards a licensing system. Policy Bureau. Chairman, paragraph 4.13, we didn't propose this, so it's hard for us to elaborate from our perspective. If a licensing system were to be implemented, then our focus is the same as the situation now. We don't want to see obstruction, and we want to maintain road safety. So if there is to be a regulatory regime, we will consider these criteria. So if they do not obstruct traffic, we will tolerate it. I ask you to answer because 4.13b, it's a question arising from Lands Department. That's why I answered you, Chairman. It's none of your business. Yes, it's Lands Department informed the Audit Commission. So is paragraph B related to you? I already answered you, Chairman. I said if we are to adopt management of a regulatory regime, we are concerned about traffic flow and road safety. So that would be the criteria we use in considering whether to approve the permit system. Lands Department. We raised this question with Development Bureau. We do not object to the permit system, but if the permit system is implemented, we will be dealing with roadside skips. So that would be a road, then you shouldn't be placing material for a day or two on a road. But if there were a permit system, then the relevant departments would have to define an acceptable inconvenience. Just now, Lands Director mentioned we already adopt a tolerant attitude towards skips as long as we don't receive complaints. If they remove it after a day or two, we won't have immediate action. But if there's obstruction or safety concerns, the police will take action. If we receive complaints, the Lands Department will take action as well. That is the current arrangement. The Director of Lands also mentioned if we are to consider a licensing regime, this will be a study area in our 3-bureau working group. That is, under what existing conditions can we accept roadside skips? Because in reality, if we adopt a strict approach, then any obstruction to roads cannot be accepted. Then basically we can't allow these skips to operate. This is the same question that Alan Leung asked in his reference to Annex A. So we've been talking about this for the last 3 or 4 hours. That's why I have a simple suggestion for your consideration. Legislators have areas where they can place their banners. Do you need to consider drafting space for skips? Because we see construction waste in all districts. You can mark some areas off for skips and have operators apply for these spaces. Is this something that you could consider? That's a suggestion for your reference. Any other questions? I'd like to follow up on behalf of Yip Jimeng. He's saying the operators have a big problem. The operators of skips want regulation of the industry because when there are accidents, there's no insurance for affected people. So, amongst the different bureaus, how do you deal with the problem of not being able to purchase insurance? If I understand correctly, he's referring to a skip not attached to a truck. The difficulty now is if the skip is on the vehicle, then it is covered by vehicle insurance. The difficulty is when the skip is not attached to the vehicle, it's just roadside, then there's an accident. Because the skip is not attached to a vehicle, then vehicle insurance will not be applicable. It's not a vehicle, so vehicle insurance is not included. Mr. Chan, you've discussed this with the legislator Yip. We are aware Mr. Yip Jiming has reflected this to Lands Department. Will you communicate with him? Because I'm just asking on his behalf. Our joint working group can follow up on this issue. So, Mr. Yao, please reflect this in the working group. While Mr. Mnausing was asking questions, out of interest, I looked up the Transport Department Internet. In paragraph 1 of his welcome speech, he says the Traffic Department is in charge of enforcing the road traffic ordinance, is in charge of managing infrastructure. We will provide world-class transport infrastructure. It will be efficient, green. We will satisfy all users, and through managing traffic, through managing traffic organizations, issuing driver's license, vehicle license, enhancing road safety and long-term planning, we will expend effort to maintain traffic flow. So he's expending effort to ensure that there's a traffic flow. So let's look at the audit report. Paragraph 3.15. G says the Transport Housing Bureau and Traffic Department are responsible for certain areas. They say that road safety, obstruction to vehicular and pedestrian traffic, damage to roads are not the only problems caused by roadside skips. Other problems caused by roadside skips include environment and hygiene issues, obstruction to shop fronts, and nuisance caused to the neighborhood. So the Transport Department chief, when he says that he wants to maintain the traffic flow, I don't think he would object, even if Secretary Yao would ask the Transport Department to help regulate the skip industry. I'd also like to refer to paragraph 4.9. It says the issue of roadside skips was first discussed among relevant bureau departments as early as 2001. Relevant bureau departments and stakeholders were generally in support of introducing a permit system for regulating skip operations. It lists A, relevant trade associations, the police, lands department, chief secretary, and transport department. So, Chairman, with reference to what I highlighted, I don't see why we don't introduce a permit system. It's 13 years late, and in the 3S study process, there is sufficient reason for the Transport Department to take the initiative. So I want to ask Secretary Yao, do you agree with my description? Chairman, we observe there are many perspectives to the skip issue. Occupation of the road, affecting driving safety, but the management of this issue involves operators, regarding road use, we have different bureaus and departments in charge. That's why we want to convene the 3-bureau working group to handle this. We will discuss how to handle this matter. So Housing and Transport Bureau have a role to play. Why did I highlight the 3 areas? It's because the Public Accounts Committee, if we have a consensus, I would feel the consensus would be the Transport Department, Transport Housing Bureau should take the initiative. It's hard to, it might be hard to have the 3 of you come in agreement, but we feel the Transport Housing Bureau should play the dominant role. We would rather have one person take the lead than having everybody in disagreement and not doing anything. So I don't require an answer. Well, even though we haven't drafted the report, all legislators raise questions from the same issue. Please continue. I'd like to ask about the Environmental Department guidelines, Transport Department guidelines, and the Lands Department internal guidelines. Currently, these are the guidelines regulating the roadside skips. So let me ask the EPD guidelines. We've referred to it on a few occasions. It's diagram 2 to 6. But the figures audited are very surprising. In paragraph 3.18, it says 39% of these roadside skips have been placed in no stopping restricted zones. 25% are placed at roundabouts, pedestrian crossings, public transport facilities. 19% have been placed on bus routes. 92% had not been placed at general laybys. Chairman, you also drive. Have you seen skips placed next to cones, flashing cones? Have you also seen in figure 3 where they have red, white reflective strips? So I have just one question. The Transport Department guidelines. First of all, and not too many people comply with it, and nobody enforces it. So could you comment on my observation? Who would like to go first?
Yeah.
Mr. Yao, Chairman, as we observed it, indeed, within the trade, people don't comply with our suggestions. I don't want to speculate on the reasons, but that is the reality. Chairman, let's look at note 9 on page 4. The names of relevant government departments are not specified in TD guidelines. What is the relevant government departments having the approval authority? Chairman, as I understand it, we issued the guidelines in 2008. At that time, we were talking about skids occupying government land. They have to apply for permission from the Lands G. So the relevant government department here refers to the Lands Department. So my question for the Director of Lands: within your term, have you been asked to approve the skips? Director of Lands? No? We are talking about approval for temporary use of government land. And in my current term, in my term of office, as pointed out in the audit report, we haven't received any such application. Let's look at also figures 6 to 8. Well, what I mentioned may not be scientific data, but I want to ask, on figures 2 to 6, we're talking about guidelines here. Have you printed the guidelines and distributed them to the trade? If yes, the print run, when was that distributed? Sorry. Can I supplement the information later on after the meeting? Well, actually, when we compiled the guidelines, we have consulted fully with the trades. But as to the number, can I supplement the information later? The guidelines were issued in 2008, and then there was some publicity, a drive, and it's now 5 to 6 years down the road. Have you done publicity again in that within that period? So, Commissioner, can you please supplement the information later? So, what's your impression, Commissioner? We have regular meetings with the skip operators and the lorry sectors, and we in our meetings we discuss
a number of topics, and I'll have to check whether this topic is covered in our meetings. So, Transport Commissioner, after this audit exercise, and before the 3S have come to a conclusion, would you be strengthening the work on publicizing the TD guidelines and do more in educating the trade, and also let the public know about the TD's requirements? Perhaps you can also set up a hotline, a complaint hotline, for drivers who are about to bump into skips to call and report on their cases. So we will talk again with the trade on the guidelines, and I noticed that after the audit report was published, the trade said that told us that the flashing yellow light lanterns at night seem to be very infeasible. But actually, we told them that the flashing lights using batteries could be used, and there is no need to install a power generator for these lights. So we will reiterate our requirements to them. And I want to explain here that in 2008, we had decided on the division of work among the government departments. So for the government hotline 1823, whenever complaints were received on the skips, the complaints will be forwarded to the Hong Kong Police Force or the LANSD, and few cases will have been referred to the Transport Department. In any case, we will try to collect more information, and we'll see whether there are black spots, and then we can strengthen our communication with the trade and to urge them to abide by the guidelines. Alan, of course, I will wait for the TD's data, but I gather now that the guidelines exist in name only. You promulgated them in 2008 and you didn't publicize them extensively, you didn't educate the public, and you didn't do a review on their effectiveness. So the guidelines were just didn't serve any real purpose, and they are not practical at all. So that's my observation now. Before coming to the EPD guidelines, I would perhaps give the Transport Commissioner or the Acting Secretary for Transport and Housing to respond to my observation, just to be fair to them. Any supplement from you, Transport Commissioner? May I add that is precisely because of the division of work. So the number of complaints received by the Transport Department would not enable us to get a full picture of the situation. We would make adjustments. Now, for complaints received through the hotline, they should be referred to the TD as well, so that we can get the full picture on the complaint situation. And before there is an overall solution to the problem, we can at least urge the trade to do more. Anything from you, the Acting Secretary? No? All right. Let's go to the next bureau, the EPD guidelines. In paragraph 2.2 of the audit report, so it says that the EPD guidelines were issued in December 2007, and there are figures on page 10 which are related. Figure 5 says that the skips should be covered with clean waterproof canvas. Well, none of the skips I've seen have a canvas cover, while in the report it's 99%. So I would like the Secretary to respond. Same question. EPD guidelines. They were just issued, and there was no one to monitor their effectiveness or to promote them. There was no hotline set up for people to report on irregularities. Is it the same case as the TD, that the EPD guidelines exist in name only without any real effect? Secretary, please. Sorry, the mic's not coming through. We hope to enhance the environment standards in skip operations. In the first provision, skips shall be covered with clean waterproof canvas, and in the Audit Commission's report, most of the skips don't do that. We also stringently enforce the legislation on skips when with environmental protection. From 2011 to September 2013, we've received 199 complaints related to skips causing environmental nuisance. We follow up on each and every one of the cases, and the environmental protection legislation covers waste disposal concerning sand and grit, noise nuisance, and whether the skips contain waste which should not be disposed at public places. We also enforce legislation in that regard. And from 2011 to September 2013, there is no need for us to enforce the law in that regard. But then we see that there is still room for improvement in the operation of the skips, and we have provided to the relevant operators some advice. There is still room for improvement in the trade. We also have worked together with the trade or industry associations in the construction and transport sectors. And in last month, November, we have written to them. We will continue to follow up with them. I think through publicity and public education, the improvement can be made. And we will also act and enforce the law in accordance with the environmental protection legislation. Anything to supplement, Secretary? No? Well, same as the TD, the EPD has issued some guidelines. Would you be educating the general mass in Hong Kong that you have such guidelines? Well, there should be a hotline marked on the skips for complaints. Say, for example, hotline 1823 can be printed on the skips, so the drivers and the members of the public can help you monitor and collect information for you to assess the effectiveness of the guidelines. This is something that you can consider. Well, if you don't do that, you will be letting the Audit Commission down, because they have spent a lot of effort in safeguarding people's lives and property. Okay, lastly, the Lands Department. The Lands Department has a Lands D instructions. On page 25, paragraph 3.7. Let's look at note 12. The Lands D has promulgated internal instructions and guidelines in the Lands D instructions for prevention, detection, and rectification of unlawful occupation of government land. I want to focus on B. It says in each DLO, it will drop a list of black spots of unauthorized placing of skips and formulate a patrol program for the black spots, and forward the list to the relevant district councils and district offices of the HAD. My question for the Director of Lands: have you done the list of actions I read out. Director of Lands. We have 12 DLOs, and only one DLO has acted in accordance with this instruction to come up with a list of black spots. And there are a couple of other districts. They have come up with a list of black spots of unhygienic places. The list was compiled together with the district councils. I think there is room for the DLO to take more initiative to embark on that route. Ellen, in paragraph 3.17 or 3.7, there are 12 DLOs and only one has done what is required. Have I missed out anything? When was the instructions first issued? If I understand it correctly, my colleague can correct me if I'm wrong. And in particular, point B, that was issued in 2009, and that was made in response to the Ombudsman's investigation report. We have come up with a list of recommendations, and that is just one of them. So the Ombudsman's recommendations are not ignored by the relevant department. So from 2009 to up to now, only one DLO has drawn up a list. This is far from satisfactory. So no matter is the Lands D instructions, EPD guidelines, or the Transport Department's guidelines, they exist in name only, don't achieve any real effect. And any administrative department who is accountable to the public, this is not acceptable. Well, there's not much point for me to go on asking anymore. In May 2010, the steering committee had made the conclusion that the problem was generally under control, and it didn't warrant any further follow-up. At that time, the police commissioner, the lands director, and the transport commissioner were on the steering committee. Well, not the people who are sitting here today, of course. I have pointed out to the witnesses today that in figure 1 of page 5, whether it is the lands department or the police's force records, the number of complaints is ever rising. And in fact, the Audit Commission has made the same remarks. And the problem of skips is deteriorating. So I would like to give the chance to the 3 departments sitting on the steering committee. They have the chance to say or to respond. I don't accept that the conclusion made in May 2010 that the roadside skip problem was generally in control. I don't think this conclusion was well-founded and was not backed up by objective data. So I think this conclusion was really something of an ostrich's policy, and it is sweeping the problem under the carpet. This is what I'm thinking. My opinion today. So I want to give them the chance to respond. Now, if they think that the conclusion made at that time was substantiated and well-grounded, well, please point that out. Well, to be fair on them, the question involved people who are not here today back in 2010. So can we ask them to go back and study it, and then they can come back with a reply in writing later? Any objection? The 3 bureaus? Or do you want to tackle the question now? Well, I'm easy one way or another. What's your inclination? Chairman, perhaps we will reply in writing. Mr. Wong, Thomas, all right. The Lands Department, anything further from you? No? Well, reply in writing later then. Anything from you, Ellen? No? We want to be forward-looking. We want to resolve the problem. And there are several issues which need to be followed up. Please respond to Mr. Leung's question. And for the 3 S's, please give us your roadmap and your action plan. And the Commissioner of Transport, please reply to Mr. Leung's question earlier. And the Commissioner of Police, please give an explanation why you made the mistake on the figures. Well, we couldn't accept an explanation as simple as that the colleagues involved were not competent in their English language skill. And also, Mr. Thomas Chan, please provide information on permits which have been applied for commencement of construction works. So I don't think we need another meeting. Well, depending on how the replies are, we will see if there is a need to hold another meeting and we can draft the report. And for the 3 secretaries and the 3 directors or commissioners, please also answer the questions relating to the steering committee. That's a separate issue. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, the Director of Audit, and thank you, members. There will be an internal meeting on Thursday.